The grand ballroom fell silent the moment the heavy oak doors creaked open, and every head turned to see the figure standing in the doorway, young man in an expensive tailored suit. His face, hidden beneath a white silk mask that covered everything except his haunted blue eyes, and the collective gasp that rippled through the wedding guests, was so sharp it seemed to cut through the champagne-scented air like a blade made of judgment and fear. This was supposed to be the most beautiful day in the Harrison family's illustrious history, the wedding of Victoria Harrison, daughter of real estate magnate Charles Harrison, to a prominent surgeon's son. But now, as the masked stranger limped slowly down the aisle, his gloved hands trembling at his sides, the celebration froze into a tableau of shock and whispered horror. "That's him," someone hissed from the third row. "That's Daniel, the son." The name hung in the air like a ghost, because Daniel Harrison had not been seen in public for 3 years, not since the accident that had stolen his face and his future, and the rumors had grown wild in his absence. Some said he was hideously scarred, others claimed he'd lost his mind, and a few whispered that his own father had locked him away in shame. Charles Harrison stood from his seat at the front, his face flushing crimson beneath his silver hair, his jaw clenched so tight it looked like it might shatter, and he strode toward his son with the kind of barely controlled fury that comes from a man who values appearances above all else. "What are you doing here?" Charles spoke through gritted teeth, his voice low but venomous. "I told you to stay home. I told you this day wasn't for you. You'll ruin everything." Daniel's shoulders sagged beneath the weight of his father's words, but he didn't turn away. Instead, he reached into his jacket pocket with shaking hands and pulled out a small wrapped gift, his voice muffled and broken behind the mask as he said, "I just wanted to give Victoria her gift. I'm still her brother. I still love her." The bride, radiant in her ivory gown, stood frozen at the altar, her bouquet trembling in her hands, tears streaming down her carefully made-up face, not tears of joy, but of shame and confusion, because she had written her brother a note 3 months ago, uninviting him, telling him she couldn't bear for her perfect day to be overshadowed by his condition, and now here he was, broken but brave, extending love where he'd only received rejection. Before Charles could grab his son's arm and force him out, a quiet voice cut through the tension like a bell of grace. "Wait. Please wait." And all eyes turned to see Esther Williams, the 62-year-old woman who had cleaned the Harrison estate for over 20 years, still wearing her simple gray cleaner's uniform, standing near the service entrance to the ballroom with her weathered hands clasped in front of her. "Esther, this is none of your concern," Charles snapped, his face darkening even further. But the elderly black woman stepped forward with a dignity that seemed to fill the room, her eyes kind but resolute. "Mr. Harrison, with respect, I think everyone here needs to know the truth about your son," she said, her voice steady. "I've kept silent for too long, and I won't let this young man suffer another moment for something that wasn't his fault." The room erupted in confused murmurs, and Daniel turned toward Esther, his masked face tilting in surprise, because he had no idea what she was about to reveal. Esther walked slowly to the center of the aisle, positioning herself between the father and son, and she looked directly at Charles with the fearless gaze of someone who has nothing left to lose. "3 years ago, after Daniel's accident," she began, her voice carrying to every corner of the silent ballroom, "I was cleaning the study late one night when I overheard you on the phone with Dr. Matthews, and I heard you refuse the specialist treatment that could have saved your son's face." A collective intake of breaths swept through the guests, and Charles's face went from red to white in an instant. "That's a lie," he stammered, but Esther continued, pulling a small phone from her pocket, an old device that looked ancient compared to the smartphones everyone else carried. "I recorded that conversation, Mr. Harrison, because I couldn't believe what I was hearing," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "You told the doctor that the surgery would cost $5 million and take Daniel out of the country for a year, And you said, I can't have my son parading around with a face that makes him look like a monster. And I won't spend that kind of money for partial results. Better he stays hidden than become a spectacle. Esther's hands shook as she pressed play, and Charles Harrison's voice filled the ballroom, cold and calculating, discussing his own son's fate as if he were a damaged piece of property rather than a human being. The boy is already weak, always has been. The recording played. This accident just proves he doesn't have what it takes to carry the Harrison name with pride. I'll provide for him financially, but he needs to understand his place now, and his place is out of sight. The recording ended, and the silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the sound of Victoria's sobbing and the whispered prayers of guests who couldn't believe what they'd just heard. Daniel stood motionless, the mask hiding whatever expression lay beneath. But his whole body seemed to tremble with the weight of a truth he'd suspected but never confirmed. His father hadn't just been ashamed of him. His father had actively chosen his son's suffering. Charles lunged toward Esther, his hand reaching for the phone. But several guests stepped between them, and the millionaire found himself suddenly powerless, his empire of control crumbling around him. Why would you do this? Daniel's voice finally emerged, small and broken, directed at his father. Why would you let me live like this when I could have been healed? Charles couldn't meet his son's eyes, his mouth opening and closing wordlessly, and for the first time in his life, the great Charles Harrison had nothing to say. Esther moved toward Daniel, her eyes brimming with tears, and she gently placed a hand on his shoulder. Baby, there's more you need to know, she said softly. After I heard that recording, I couldn't sleep, couldn't eat, couldn't live with myself knowing you were suffering when you didn't have to. So I started saving every penny I had, and I reached out to my church, to my community, to everyone I knew. She pulled out a folded envelope from her other pocket, worn and creased from being carried close to her heart. It took 3 years, but we did it. My community, my church family, people you've never met who just heard your story and wanted to help. We raised $4,800,000. Her voice broke as she said it, and Dr. Matthews said he'd cover the rest, that he'd perform the surgery for free, because what your father did was unconscious, and you deserve a chance at life. The ballroom erupted, not in gasps this time, but in something that sounded like collective weeping, because here was a cleaning woman who made barely above minimum wage, who had given everything, who had moved heaven and earth for a young man whose society had forgotten. Daniel's knees buckled, and he sank to the floor, his masked face in his hands, his whole body shaking with sobs that came from a place deeper than physical pain. Why? He asked Esther through his tears. Why would you do this for me? I was never even kind to you. I barely noticed you existed. Esther knelt beside him, her old knees protesting, but her spirit unbowed. And she lifted his masked face gently so his eyes met hers. Because, baby, I know what it's like to be invisible, she said, tears streaming down her weathered brown cheeks. I know what it's like to be judged by something you can't control. To have people look through you like you don't matter. And I couldn't watch you disappear into that same darkness. Not when I had the power to light a candle. She pulled out another paper, this one crisp and official. Dr. Matthews is here, at this wedding, as a guest of your sister. He came hoping to see you, and he's ready to schedule your surgery for next week if you're willing, she said. You can have your face back. Daniel, you can have your life back. Victoria suddenly broke from her position at the altar, her wedding dress billowing around her as she ran down the aisle and dropped to her knees beside her brother, wrapping her arms around him as she sobbed. I'm so sorry, Danny. I'm so sorry. I was selfish and cruel, and I don't deserve your forgiveness. But please, please let them help you. Please, take this chance. Daniel's arms slowly came up to embrace his sister, and the siblings held each other in the middle of the aisle, while 300 wedding guests watched the most beautiful moment many of them had ever witnessed. Not the planned ceremony, but this raw, broken, real moment of human connection. Charles Harrison stood apart, watching his children reconcile, watching the cleaning woman he'd barely acknowledged in 20 years become the hero of the day. And something seemed to crack inside his chest, some calcified wall around his heart that he'd built brick by brick over decades of pursuing wealth and status at the expense of everything else. "I don't expect forgiveness," Charles finally spoke, his voice hoarse and small. "I don't deserve it. I failed as a father, as a man, as a human being, and I'll spend the rest of my life knowing that a woman who I paid poverty wages had more love in her little finger than I had in my entire soul." He turned to Esther, his eyes red-rimmed. "How much do you have left of what you raised?" he asked, and Esther looked confused. "After the surgery costs, probably about 200,000, she said. "We were going to use it for Daniel's recovery expenses." Charles pulled out his phone with shaking hands. "I'm transferring $10 million right now," he said, his voice breaking. $5 million to cover everything for Daniel, the surgery, recovery, whatever he needs. Send $5 million to you, Esther, and your community, to do with as you see fit, because you've shown me what wealth actually means, and it has nothing to do with bank accounts." The room was silent except for the sound of Charles's fingers on his phone screen. And moments later, Esther's old device pinged with a notification that made her gasp. "I can't," she started, but Charles held up his hand. "You can, and you will. Because it's not charity's restitution, it's justice. It's the least I can do to begin to make amends for the pain I've caused," he said, then turned to Daniel. "Son, I know I have no right to ask anything of you, but I'm asking anyway. Let me be there for your surgery. Let me be there for your recovery, not because I deserve it, but because I need to learn how to be the father I should have been all along." Daniel slowly stood, supported by his sister, and he looked at his father for a long moment, and though no one could see his expression behind the mask, his voice when he spoke carried a quality that sounded like the beginning of healing. "I'll let you be there," he said quietly, "not because what you did is okay, because it's not bet, because Esther just taught me something about grace that I need to practice, about being bigger than the pain, about choosing light over darkness." He turned to Esther, and even behind the mask, everyone could sense the smile in his voice. "Will you be there too?" he asked her. "Will you hold my hand when I'm scared?" Esther wrapped the young man in her arms, this boy she'd watched grow up from a distance, this young man she'd moved mountains to save, and she whispered, "Baby, I'll be right there, every single step of the way." The wedding didn't happen that day. Victoria and her fiancé postponed it by mutual agreement, deciding that some moments were more important than planned celebrations. But what did happen was something more profound. A family began to heal. A community was honored. A woman's quiet heroism was recognized. And a young man who had been living in darkness finally saw a path to light. 3 months later, after successful surgeries and careful recovery, Daniel Harrison stood in front of a mirror without a mask for the first time in 3 years, looking at a face that bore subtle scars but was undeniably his own, alive and expressive and free. Esther stood beside him, as she'd promised, and when he turned to her, with tears running down his restored cheeks, she simply smiled and said, "There you are, baby. There's the beautiful boy I always knew was there." The money Esther's community received was used to start a foundation that helped other people who couldn't afford life-changing medical treatments, and Daniel became its most passionate advocate, spending his days telling his story and raising awareness about the power of community and the danger of valuing appearance over humanity. Charles Harrison stepped down from his company, transferring leadership to others while he spent his time volunteering and learning, for the first time in his life, what it meant to serve rather than be served. Victoria and her husband named their first child Esther, and the elderly cleaning woman became the most honored grandmother figure in the Harrison family, proof that family is not always about blood, but always about love And on quiet evenings, Daniel would sometimes visit Esther in the modest home she still chose to live in despite her newfound wealth. And they would sit on her porch drinking sweet tea, and he would ask her to tell him again about the night she decided to save him. And she would smile and say what she always said, "Baby, I didn't save you, God put you on my heart, and my community lifted you up, and your own courage brought you through." And that's how miracles really work. Not one person being a hero, but a whole lot of people choosing love over indifference, one small decision at a time. The lesson was simple, but transformative, that true wealth is measured not in what we possess, but in what we're willing to give, that the most powerful people are often those the world overlooks, that healing requires not just medical intervention, but human connection, that family must be built on love, rather than obligation, and that every single person we encounter carries infinite worth, regardless of how they look, what they do, or where they come from, because, in the end, we are all just broken people, capable of beautiful things when we choose compassion over judgment, grace over condemnation, and love over fear.